Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're in round 4 of our coverage of the 2017 U.S. Chess Championships. Our competitors today, white is played by Wesley, so currently tied for first with a few players with 2 points after 3 rounds. One of those players he is tied with, he's facing today with a black piece, and that is Onischuk. And both of these guys beat the same player. Wesley So beat Shabalov in round 1, and Alex beat him in round 2. Besides that, they have 2 draws. So coming into this round, both players feeling pretty confident. We'll go ahead and get started with Wesley So with the white pieces. Knight to f3. Pawn down here, d5, pawn g3, getting ready to castle on the king side, and fianchetto his bishop here to g2. Knight f6, bishop g2, pawn e6, castle on the king side, bishop e7, pawn c4. And usually when you see this, it's kind of a delayed queen's gambit. So after the king castle's over here, it's almost guaranteed that we're going to see pawn to d4. Most players are not playing the English opening as much. If they are playing the English opening, maybe they transition into something around knight to c3 and try to go that route. But usually it's just the queen's gambit decline line. And so that's almost what it looks like Alex was preparing for with the pawn here to e6 and pawn to d5. Wesley So decided, we're going to change things up a little bit, and we're going to definitely be playing the English opening. No queen's gambit today. And we're going to play pawn to b3. So a pretty irregular opening variation, specifically in the English opening. And it took black by surprise. He wasn't really sure how he would respond to this. He ended up playing pawn to b6. I think it would have been a little sharper if he'd have played pawn to d4. He does have protection from his queen. This limits some of the moves that white can play. He can't be bringing his knight here to c3. He can't push forward with pawn to d4, which he would at some point like to do. It kind of ties down his knight here on f3 to this pawn. Later on, if he wants to, he could push forward with pawn to c5, really solidify that. You know, we could see continue bishop to b2, because that's one of the main reasons that we see pawn to b3. Pawn c5, solidify. If he wants to kind of break this up, that's fine. Knight c6, we could see the pawn capture, the pawn recapture here on d4. And this is still just kind of a pain. All these pieces are going to have to deal with this pawn before the pawn here on d2 can really do too much. So I think this would have been fine, you know, even if queen to e2, queen b6, adding more pressure in the center of the board. I maybe like this a little bit more, but decided to go with the pawn here to b6. Wesley So continues with bishop to b2, and then Alex plays a bishop b7, fianchettoing on the queen side of the board. Pawn takes on d5, knight recaptures on d5, and then pawn up to d4. And this is where I think Wesley So did a lot of his preparation with the pawn in the center of the board. He's got a nice little pawn chain. He has very active board state. He can get his knight involved. He has these semi-open files that he can get his rook over here to, like c1, really control a lot of the board that he wants to. He has bishops on both sides of the board, so double bishop pair, but controlling a lot of the board. You can see he controls more than the double bishop pair here with this dark square bishop, not really attacking too much with these dark squares right here. Both of white's aiming at the center of the board. Knight to d7. You know, I'm not sure the knight to d7 is my favorite. Could have gone completely YOLO if he wanted to. Pawn to f5 looks interesting. That's kind of the, hey, if you want to get creative with pawn to b3, we're just going to go completely off the radar with pawn to f5. Could have also tried, let's say c5, just break up the center of the board if he wants to. Pawn to a5 if he wants to go crazy over on the queen side. But knight to d7 is fine, but that's really just preparing pawn to c5. It's pretty telegraphed, knowing that there's not a lot of other great squares. You don't want to bring your knight over here to d7 and then bring it to knight to f6 to really control the knight to d5. d5, this is not where you want your knight anyway. And right now I can't come here to c5 or e5. Rook over here to e1, just preparing to push the pawn up and control the center of the board. Pawn to c5 as expected, and then pawn to e4. Kicking the knight back here to f6. Knight c3, last kind of development move from white. And then we do see an exchange off the center of the board. And then knight down here to e5. And this opens up the door for the queen to attack and wants to make sure that he doesn't have a cramped position, because with the knight here on d7. It does kind of limit the rooks if they want to kind of control these open files, and the queen can't really do too much. So knight here on e5 is going to be where it sits for a while. It does also stop this pawn right here on e4 from pushing a little bit. So this bishop here on g2 does have a little bit limited exposure to controlling the rest of the board. Queen to e2. Bishop down d5, getting the dark square bishop we talked about wasn't very active, so it's a little bit more active. Both of the bishops kind of eyeing down on the king side of the board from Wesley. So rook to d1, controlling this open file. Queen here to e7, getting the queen out of the way, getting ready to bring his rooks over and control those open files as well. Knight to a4, attacking the bishop. The bishop's kind of forced to take the knight here on d4. It gets a little tricky if you were to try to be cute. He does want to come back to d6. That's a little bit too passive. But if you were to try something, bishop to b4, then all of a sudden pawn to a3 kicks it back. And now all of a sudden the knight could take it, and black's kind of just wasted a move, but he could instead even play knight to b5, preparing for knight up here to c7. So all in all, it just gets pretty bad. He decides to go ahead and give up his bishop pair. Takes with his bishop here on d4, and then the bishop recaptures. Knight comes back here to c6, attacking the bishop. And he had a few options here. I thought he might try to just take here on f6. I don't think that Alex would recapture with his queen, just because pawn to e5, forcing the queen to move. And then all of a sudden, rook to d6, really getting up in the business of black. So I think instead he might have tried with the pawn taking from g7. So after the pawn takes, we see rook over here to c1. Not the best pawn chain, 3 pawn chains going into the endgame. I think this favors white, but it looks like Wesley. So even though he has a slight advantage, I think, with this exchange, it seems like he feels more confident with more pieces on the board, specifically a double bishop pair, that he'll give up that slight advantage in exchange to make sure that he holds on to his material. And that's kind of where you feel like someone who's playing at the top of their game. That's how they want to be playing. They don't want to exchange down on the board as much as possible. They want to keep as much and just see what they can do with it because they think they can outmaneuver their opponents. So bishop e3, rook over here to d8, trying to control the center of the board. Knight here to c3, queen down here b4, putting pressure, getting it more involved. Queen here on e7 wasn't doing too much. Queen over here, b2, protecting this knight. Knight down here to a g4, attacking the bishop. Just says, hey, I want to go ahead and exchange this material off the board, even if you don't want to. Bishop here to f4, does not want to exchange, wants to get it in a very active position right here. And the knight to e5. And I really like this square from Alex. I think this blocks exactly what white wants to be controlling. It's has a lot of protection from both of the knights here. This pawn can't push forward, so this bishop's not doing too much. All in all, I really like this position. I think both sides have a lot of good things going for them, but I would give a slight advantage to black. White continues with pawn to a3, forcing the queen back. Queen here to c5, knight a4, queen here b5. We do see a twofold repetition after queen to c5. The knight comes back here to a4. And then after queen to b5, again, Wesley So had the opportunity to go for a threefold repetition. If he just comes back here to knight to c3, then we're going to have a draw in the game. And afterwards, they kind of asked him, like, hey, you had a draw. You know, it's not necessarily the best position right here. If anything, I would kind of give the very slightest of edge to black in this position. It's going to be very difficult for white, I think, to find an opening here. Wesley So just said, hey, I wanted to try for a victory. Maybe objectively in this position, I should have gone for the draw. But decided to play on, did not want to go for the threefold repetition draw. Instead decided to play pawn to h3. So kind of reset, and let's keep going from here. And then knight to d3 is where things started to get a little bit interesting. Probably more correct is to just take here first. Rook takes on d1. Knight down here to d3. We do see the rook take, so that's pretty interesting right away. Rook takes back on d3. Pawn takes the knight here on g4. And then after the queen comes down, takes the pawn. Bishop to F1, and we see an exchange on board with the queens. And so we kind of reach the in-game state here where black gave up, some of his pieces in exchange for Wesley So's rook, and black does have a pawn advantage just slightly. But this is very dangerous to give Wesley So double bishop pair going into the in-game. Knight's just going to be difficult to deal with. Black has to make sure that he dominates all these files with his rooks and puts as much pressure that he can with this light square bishop. Wesley So just needs to completely overwhelm his opponent with all of his pieces. And so we kind of go into the in-game from here. Rook to b3, attacking the knight. Knight comes up here to c4, wants to get it as aggressive as possible. Rook to d8, knight up here to d6 is being protected by this bishop. So all of a sudden it's come down here from b2, and it's starting to cut away some of the critical squares that black has. Bishop to a8, not exactly where you want one of your aggressive pieces back here on a8. Yes, it is controlling some of these diagonal squares, but you really want that bishop to be in the center, controlling a lot of the board, especially in an open board state going into the in-game. Pawn here to g5 from Wesley So. Alex plays rook to c3. Pawn up here to a4. Just doesn't want to have to worry about this. He wants to start to put a little pressure on the queen side as well. Rook here to c5. Pawn up here to e5. Rook down to d7. And this is kind of an interesting move. Bishop to e3, attacking the rook and saying, what are you going to do here? Giving up this pawn and material. And what does he give up the pawn for? Just so he can control this file on, with his rook here on c1. So we talk a lot about having your rooks control files because it gives them so much reach and does exactly what they're meant to do and control a lot of the critical squares on the board. But Wesley So just proved, I'm going to give up material for the sole point of trying to control that file, which is always nice to see. Rook back here to d8. Now his rooks are kind of separated. You want them to be connected so they have some protection. You don't have to have your other pieces, your bishops, or even your pawns protecting them. They can kind of control each other. Rook up to c7. Anytime you can get your rook to your opponent's 7th rank, that's always a good thing. As you can kind of see right here, this knight on d6 is going to also be protecting this right here. Black cannot take the knight on d6 because it's just going to be checkmate. Check. Rook comes back here to d8 and then checkmate. So that's not going to be good. Instead decides to play rook to d5, trying to add a little bit more pressure so he could take the knight if he wants to. But then just knight to f7. It is protected. Rook here to f8, just being completely defensive. But it's just not helping because he doesn't have any of his pieces really connected or doing too much. And this bishop on a8 just isn't doing anything at all. Pawn up to g6 and says, yeah, I'm fine giving up that material. So you have double pawns here and you just have 3 pawn chains that are not helping each other at all. And so I'm going to play knight to g5. This also starts to open up the door for some really strong attacks from the bishops. One thing that gets in the way of bishops is strong pawn chains. So this is just kind of eating away at some of the strong pawn chains that black has, which is really his only defense from his king right now. Rook down here to d1, not really threatening too much. This bishop is going to have a few moves. It wants to maybe come down to d5 and then c4, which would still be being attacked by this rook to even start to put pressure. It does pin down the bishop, but it also takes away the ability for the rook on d1 to do anything. So the knight's just going to come up here, take material on e6, says thanks Alex for that move. Rook to e8, rook over here, g7, check. And then just going to gobble up these 2 pawns. Very, very easy for Wesley So to do. And now protecting this knight. Now the bishop does get involved into the game. A little bit late to the party because after bishop to d4, Alex is forced to resign. There's just too much pressure going on. Wesley So's up a lot of material and there's no way for him to really stop the onslaught that's going to be going on from here. So all in all, congratulations to Wesley So trying some really out-of-the-box openings, see what his opponent does. I think Alex defended extremely well for an English opening variation we don't see very often. And then kudos to Wesley So also for not accepting the draw and fighting on and getting his opponent to a spot where he probably thought it was going to be a draw. Feeling pretty good about it. After 4 rounds, you're going to be tied at the top you tie Wesley So, who's kind of the top player in this tournament when he has the white pieces. And I think he just got a little flustered after pawn 2h3. Didn't know how to cope with that and then just made a few mistakes. So all in all, exciting game. Really excited to see all these rounds have some great games. Not some of the cookie cutter, openings and defenses we've seen in some other tournaments. This has been fireworks most of the tournament. So hopefully you guys are enjoying, and I will see you tomorrow for round 5.